Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast, the Replay series. I'm your host, Tracy Chernoff, and I'm thrilled to have you join us once again as we journey through the episodes that have topped charts around the world. In this podcast series, we're revisiting some of our most insightful, thought-provoking, and transformative conversations with industry experts, thought leaders, and practitioners. These episodes have made waves, sparking meaningful conversation and inspiring positive change throughout human resources. Whether you're a dedicated listener who's been with us from the start or you're just tuning in for the first time, the Replay series offers a chance to dive deep into the core principles that guide our exploration into HR practices. So get ready to rediscover the discussions that continue to shape the future of HR. Without further ado, let's step back in time and immerse ourselves into the podcast's top charted episodes. Let the replay begin. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. I hope that you have already done this, but don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. Today's guest is Megan Hunter. She is the co-founder and CEO of the High Conflict Institute in San Diego, California. She also has her MBA. She is an expert in high conflict personalities and helping people influence high conflict situations by adapting their approach. She's written several books on high conflict interactions and disputes and has provided training across the US and 7 countries. So obviously, for those of us in HR, we experience conflict a lot and we experience potentially a lot of high conflict personalities. And I know you're probably thinking, well, how do I know what a high conflict personality is? Don't worry, we are going to get into that. So without further ado, let's jump right into the episode. Make sure that at the end, you share your thoughts, you review, you subscribe, whatever you have to do to continue to support this podcast and come back next week. Do it. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll get right into it now. Welcome, Megan, to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing with us some insights that I think we all could benefit from.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure, Tracy, and I'm so happy to be on. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. It's always nice to bring some interesting guests on the podcast and hopefully, have the audience learn, but also I always end up learning from every guest that I've had on. So it's, also a selfish thing that I get to learn about high conflict personalities today, which is not something that I've actually ever learned about, I don't think. So
Yeah, well, interestingly too, I learn a lot from, when I'm on a podcast, I learn from others, and anywhere we go, like, right, we love to learn from everyone else and absorb all of that because it just helps inform us. So I'm sure
yeah.
I will learn a lot from you today as well.
Oh, well, I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I think the perfect place to start this discussion is to actually ask you to clarify for us what it means to have a high conflict personality, or even like what you do in your role and how you've been able to define high conflict and high conflict personalities.
Yeah, that's a great start, actually, because it is kind of confusing for people because the term high conflict just has a negative connotation right off the bat, right? And high conflict personality sounds not so great. And, it's mostly right. But it's, kind of what it's not. We can start there. It's not just a loud argument or being overly emotional or angry, because we all can feel that way. We all have emotions and a wide range of emotions. But what the true definition of high conflict is probably best told if I give you a little background of how I got here. Um, and that is, I was the family law specialist at the Arizona Supreme Court way back in the day. And I just kind of fell in love with the kind of the blend of law and psychology, because that's what family law is. That's, people going through divorces and child custody disputes, that it's law and psychology. So it doesn't take you long in the family law arena to recognize that there's this thing called high conflict divorce. And it's what everyone in the divorce field sort of dreads, because these cases are back in court a lot. The parents fight a lot over just about everything. And it seems that nothing resolves their issues. Where most people, let's say 80%, can handle their divorce or, through mediation or some other out of court process. But these high conflict cases are just using up the resources and they're in court a lot. So I got very interested in it. And what, kind of fascinated and stumped me is why were thousands of people, really, really smart people around the world working in this field, but no one could really figure out how to deal with these high conflict cases successfully. So I kind of made it my mission to find someone, and I eventually did. And it was a guy named Bill Eddy, who was a licensed clinical social worker who later became a family law attorney and applied his work uh, from psychiatric hospitals to family law when he started to see the same
Wow.
behaviors showing up.
Wow.
And just a really smart guy, and he put the puzzle pieces together to form what he calls a high conflict personality. And so the true definition of it is, it's not a diagnosis. It's not in the DSM-5. But it is a description of a pattern of behavior. So someone with a high conflict personality repeats four main things. Number one, unmanaged emotions. Two, extreme behaviors. Three, all or nothing thinking. And four, they focus on a target of blame. So they're just sort of blaming someone all the time. And when it gets right down to it, it's most of us, when life is going along, we're navigating through life, there are troubles and struggles, but we can be flexible and, manage our emotions and all of those great things. But someone with a high conflict personality, when they run into those things, they really struggle because of these four characteristics.
Interesting. Well, I'm sure that everyone listening to this has already stopped listening for a portion of that because they're analyzing whether or not they are a high conflict personality. Because even I, for a moment there, and I always have to remind myself because I constantly let my mind run, I had to remind myself, wait, don't start thinking about yourself. You got to listen to the whole explanation. But I'm sure that the listeners are already starting to think like, oh gosh, am I that person? So if someone did have that revelation from what you've just described and defined for us, how do they navigate that? Am I jumping too far ahead to even ask, like, how does a high conflict personality one realize that they are that way or have those four descriptions and characteristics, or is there more to the puzzle there that we have to figure out first?
Well, I love that you're asking this because it's really wonderful when someone comes, and almost everyone we speak to, whether it's a training or a consultation, they'll come to us like at the first break in the training and say, "Oh, I'm really embarrassed, but I do have to ask you this. I do some of those things that you're talking about, and does that mean I'm high conflict?" So here's the thing, Tracy: if you're having these thoughts, that means you're having insight. People with high conflict personalities do not have insight into their flaws or into their personality quirks, right? That they have
Interesting.
these issues. So, yeah, I mean, we all have a little junk in our trunk, as I like to say. I came into this with some all or nothing thinking, and didn't realize it until I studied it more and more and realized, oh, I do that, I do that. So we can clean up and tweak certain areas, but if you're thinking, "Ooh, I do that," you're having some insight. So officially, I can say you're not high conflict.
Woo, thank you. I'm going to make sure to add that to my resume. Not a high conflict personality. No, I'm
There
kidding.
you go.
Yeah,
And
right?
it's interesting because I've done many consultations and trainings, leadership retreats, all kinds of events like that, where an actual high conflict person is seated across the table from me and looking
Mm.
right into my eyes as I'm training about this, which is super uncomfortable for me. But they, I just have to keep reminding myself, they don't realize that they are high conflict. They think everyone else in the room is, or someone else in the room is.
This is a great segue to my next question, which I'm going to preface first and add some flavor to, I guess. But this idea around like the high conflict person or personality, um, thinking that they are not part of the problem or that everyone else is the problem. We see that a lot, of course, in just in being HR leaders and having exposure to a lot of people potentially. And a lot of the listeners, I know I shared this with you, a lot of the listeners are in their HR careers and some are breaking into their HR careers. So for some, this is something that they're expecting, they're anticipating having interactions with individuals who may become agitated when they're told, one thing versus another, or who are not as agreeable, for example, as others. And it's not to say that that's a bad thing, but I remember from our first discussion that I had shared that in my experience with people in my HR career, there are those interactions with people who I now understand potentially as having high conflict personalities where it's so almost impossible to get through to that person, and there's always this drama surrounding whatever it is that they have concerns over. For example, super broad strokes here in terms of context, but how do HR leaders have to change their approach when they're interacting with or dealing with someone who does have this all or nothing, um, almost like approach to the challenges day to day in the workplace?
Well, it can be tricky, but you really have to get an understanding of the way this person's brain is working. But if you don't have the opportunity to do that, I guess the the best way to approach every interaction is with kind of a some skepticism about the accuracy of someone's stories, their version of events,
Mm.
because what is really true about the high conflict personality is that everything to them feels very normal, natural, and necessary. Meaning, I look at it as they have a different operating system, and we expect
Mm.
everyone to sort of have similar operating systems, and then we use this, you know, pretty much the same approach with everyone, a little bit on a range, but with the high conflict personality, it's an opposites world. So it feels very natural for them to come in and tell you this very intense story of how they've been wounded or victimized or something like that. And because of this wonderful thing called emotional persuasion and it's going on between our brains, you can get emotionally hooked and believe the victim's story. Now, it may be
Oh.
true and it may be partially true, but it may not be true at all. So you really have to investigate and have an understanding that with the high conflict personality, there's a fear driving that operating system, and it's a fear of being dominated, feeling inferior, feeling ignored, feeling betrayed, or feeling abandoned. And so once you have that understanding, it takes some sophistication a bit. It really makes everything they're going to do predictable, which makes everything you're going to do predictable.
Interesting. I'm curious, when an HR leader is dealing with something that's, you know, coming up with, with someone that might have this high conflict personality. And of course, you mentioned that this is not a diagnosis. So I definitely caution anyone listening from, applying a label to individuals as being high conflict versus not high conflict, because then we're just, pigeonholing people that might just have other challenges going on, and feel free to disagree or agree with that statement. But when someone, let's say someone is falling into these characteristics and there is that challenge with the HR leader or the manager in general, where they're really trying to make sense of what's happened, they've investigated, and there is, a discrepancy, right? Is there a reason not to say to this high conflict personality that there's a discrepancy in their story? Is there specifically an approach there that is different than maybe what our intuition tells us to do, which is to be honest and direct and to tell them that there's maybe a misunderstanding?
Yeah, you spot on. Great question. So the you have to approach. You can do the same thing with someone with a high conflict personality as you do with everyone else, but you have to preface it first with getting them calm. And we get people calm by giving them empathy, attention, and respect, which is the acronym is EAR. So you just preface everything with an EAR statement. Oh, that sounds really frustrating. Oh, that must have been challenging, just anything like that.
Yeah.
That calms the reactive brain because they really get stuck in these right brain emotions, which are, sort of fight or flight, survival. This is very primal. And they need, you know, as I said, this is very normal and natural and necessary to them. And so we are the ones that have to adapt because they can't. They don't know that this is not normal, that this is
Mm.
not, outside the norm of what other people are doing. So therefore, the HR person has to give a little empathy at first, give a little attention or a little respect, and you can use those actual words or use some other words. So I call it the calm before think method, and I use a capital B and the number 4. Calm before think, and the reason I make a point of it is not natural. We typically, particularly in the workplace, any wherever you work, whatever role you're in, you're there to problem solve. So we're in problem solving mode all the time. And it's
Right.
really natural for us because we have our own defaults to just go straight into problem solving. And what you have to do differently with these folks is get them calm first before you get them thinking.
Hmm. Interesting. Very interesting. I'm taking a second to reflect there because when I think about my years in really very traditional HR roles, and especially dealing with employee relations, which, if for anyone listening who doesn't necessarily have that, like we call it ER experience, employee relations experience, there are a lot of horror stories about dealing with ER issues, whether it's harassment and intimidation or even, different things just regarding like employee complaints, right? Like it really is full scope and full spectrum when it comes to those ER specific roles, which is really where I spent the majority of my career in those types of problem solving positions, specifically facing people and the majority of the workforce. But I think about those experiences where I have dealt with probably people who potentially fall into this high conflict category. I can think of a few experiences that just, no matter what you say, what you do, if they're not calm to this point, there's really it can be derailed very quickly. But one of the things that I was reflecting on as you were sharing that before is that, there's a lot of discussion nowadays around what HR can and cannot be expected to take on. And I think there's a really fine line for HR leaders, especially in these people facing roles that are, maybe have a percentage of ER in their job responsibilities. There's a fine line between being empathetic and, also being able to rectify some of those challenges and not being overly empathetic. And then again, on the other side of that fine line, being too empathetic, where then it's everyone comes to HR just to complain and there's no focus on solutions. So, when you hear that, as far as like making sure that HR is not just like the complaint department and also does provide this solutions based approach, when it comes down to the calm before think method, how do you encourage HR leaders to develop that skill set? Because I think, it's already built in that we're supposed to be like approachable, empathetic to a certain degree, able to solve problems, all those things. But if they haven't had the opportunity to develop that skill set, how do they do that to be calm, to focus on the calm, but also not be the people that are just always complained to without this focus on solving the problem, if that
Mm.
makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's a great question because we do get asked a lot, like, do we have to listen forever? Do we have to give your statements forever? And no, you
Yeah.
don't. And here's the thing. This high conflict personality, and I just want to say here, I agree with you. We don't want to label people. We don't want to,
Right.
pigeonhole them. These are folks that probably have trauma in their background. It's unaddressed, unresolved, and they respond really well to empathy, attention, and respect. But that doesn't mean that you listen forever. High conflict personalities, that brain doesn't stop itself. So it needs someone else to stop it for them, stop their behaviors, um, and to give them structure. So if I were in an HR role, I would try to make the complaint process, or any conversation process, very structured. It's a good idea to have very strong policies about what your complaint process is,
Mm.
how it works, length of time. I prefer, and I'm not an HR specialist, so I don't know, and I don't know all the laws surrounding the whole industry, but I really like having a one sheet. You get one sheet to write out your complaint. I prefer a written complaint instead of oral, because writing causes people to think. It gets them in the
Mm.
problem solving part of their brain, and that's where that they will feel calmer, and they're not then stuck in the blaming part of their brain, the all or nothing, unmanaged emotions, and extreme behaviors. Now they'll still come out, right? But when they're
Right.
writing, it slows them down a bit, and it structures them a bit. So, and then you can use ear when you do meet with them. And ear doesn't mean, excuse me, that you just keep repeating yourself over and over, but three little words can be the game changer, if such as, tell me more, or yeah, that does sound hard. That calms them. And then you can follow it up with a question like, um, what options have you thought of? Have you tried doing some different things? So, so the calm gets them, the ear gets them calm. Then you follow it up with a question, and that kind of shoves them into the problem solving part of the brain. And you want a lot of flow between those two hemispheres, and you're the one that's responsible for the flow. And that's what an ear statement does. It opens up that bridge between the hemispheres, and they but then you kind of have to keep them there with asking questions. And then if they get riled up again, right, then you just give a little more ear and follow it up with a question. So you are guiding them down this path that they're not used to being guided down. They're feeling calm when they talk to you because you are in the lead. They don't know it, but you're structuring this in a way that works for the rules of their operating system. And as they feel calm with you, their safety increases, their feeling of safety increases. And
Mm.
when your safety increases, your trust increases. When your trust increases, your complaints decrease.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things I guess I want to ask in response to that is, well, what happens if someone is totally inconsolable and doesn't become calm? You try all of these things, you're leveraging, these skill sets and approaches, and the person doesn't become calm at any point. How do you navigate that?
Oh, that can be a little bit tricky, but
Yeah.
usually, an ear statement will, and it depends on the person. If you have someone that's very much on the I need to feel superior track, and you keep giving them ear statements, they might just get frustrated. But this
Yeah.
is all grounded in science, and it's the science that works for this type of, you know, issue. So if someone's really inconsolable, you can say, look, why don't we just take a break and talk about this, another time. So if they're breaking down, crying, hand them a tissue. That's a show of ear, empathy,
Mm.
attention. That's right. That's showing them attention. And then, you can structure that. And structuring things is a gift for them, right? So you say, this is, I'm sure this is really hard. And here's a tissue box. And how about we just reschedule this for tomorrow at 2? And they will like that because, you've given them the attention that they need, and you've rescheduled something that shows them you're not dropping this, that it is important to you.
Interesting. Thank you for answering all of those questions. One thing that stuck with me is this point on the potential that there's a link between high conflict personalities and a trauma response, or a background of having trauma in their life experience. So to shift gears a little bit, is there, and again, we are not diagnosing anyone here, and we're certainly not labeling anyone, But from what you've seen in your experience, is there a connection, or are there any statistics that you can share where high conflict personalities and mental illness are linked?
Yeah, it's a little tricky, I guess, but we and I know HR folks don't really like to hear about personality disorders, and I'm not here to preach personality disorders, but our work is based in these disorders, and in particular 5 of them. And you know, there's a lot of research and information available about the impact of trauma in the development of the personality, right? Sometimes it doesn't mean everyone that's had trauma is going to develop a personality disorder, and most
Right.
people who have one don't even know they have one. So that's why I prefer to just see it as someone with a different operating system, and I am going to learn the tools that work with that operating system so that I can help them, right? Now, they may not be able to stay in the workplace because they're too chaotic, disruptive, and you know, uh,
Yeah.
you lose competitive advantage. You have attrition of other employees because it's too toxic.
Yeah.
But really, this most of it does come from trauma. Um, and I've worked with a lot of people in companies of all sizes and profit, nonprofit, government, across the board. It doesn't matter where people are. What matters is, where they've come from. And some are able through coaching to, kind of tweak some of those issues. And, they might open up their trauma background a little bit and do
Mm.
a tiny bit of trauma work on their own, and learn some skills. And we actually have it's called New Ways for Work coaching method that really helps them learn these skills, how to manage their emotions, have moderate behaviors, flexible thinking, and taking responsibility. It's a no shame, no blame approach. It's
Mm.
really, really nice. And it just really, a lot of people can have success from that. Where others might still really struggle and they might need very intensive trauma treatment outside of the workplace. I've seen some be able to stick with the job and kind of come on board, and
Mm.
these are the folks that are, wearing out the carpet to
Yeah.
the HR office because everything that goes wrong, they need to tell someone. They want to come to authority and make a complaint.
Yeah.
It just feels very necessary to them to do that. So if you can get them turned around through some coaching, then great. If not, they're probably just going to keep doing that.
Yeah. I have definitely, in my experience, I've seen, and we've successfully have been able to turn around some of those, you know, predictable behaviors, I guess we can say. I have to say, like, to be really candid, and I'm sure that there will be listeners who agree and disagree on this. It is definitely really a lot of work and quite exhausting to manage through unmanaged emotions.
Mm,
And I think whether the person has a high conflict personality or not, anyone with unmanaged emotions is exhaustive. And, in a business setting, um, to your point, it can create a lot of chaos. It can create a toxic work environment. And then you have the HR leader who is demonstrating compassion and empathy for this person as they should, and hopefully their leader as well, also now having to engage in this conversation potentially around performance management. So, I mean, this might not be exactly the experience for every single person, but when someone does have unmanaged emotions and is very all or nothing, for example, that usually, to your point again, creates this environment of for the potential of catastrophe
mm, mm.
and challenge, and everything feels heavy. Like I can think about like specific people that I've interacted with who haven't been able to turn this around, and we've had to, like, in my past, manage out for just their performance, and potentially even standing in the way of their performance because of all of these things being unable to be changed. So how does a person, whether they're in HR or, whether they're the manager in this situation, how do you balance being empathetic, having the ear approach, the calm before the think, and also recognizing when you've done what you can do and now this is a performance issue rather than something that we can hopefully turn around?
Yeah, it's a good question. Some people think that you should not have anyone with these behaviors in the
Yeah.
workplace because they are so disruptive. And I've seen it go many different directions, and
Mm.
a lot of it depends on the performer, right? We'll have organizations call and say, "Look, I have this really high performer, but they just." Are so destructive to everyone around them.
Yeah.
It might be the best salesperson or whatever the
Oh
position,
yeah.
right?
Yes. Yes.
Critical positions, and they don't want to invest in new training. I mean, your listeners know all of this.
Yeah.
So, there are some that say just if they can't improve in 60 days, they need to be out. And, I agree with that, but I also realize the reality of life. And the reality
Right.
is that sometimes we do want to keep people in these positions, and separate out job performance from the people skills, right? And try to get them skilled up. And there is research showing that coaching. I'm sure you all know this more than I do. That coaching, performance coaching in the workplace can be very, very effective.
Mm-hmm.
Now these are the trickiest. These are the trickiest to deal with, but we've seen it work. Um, and there are some people that really should go. If you have someone that really seeks to dominate, when things don't go their way, they want to destroy. You don't
Yeah.
want those people in your company, right?
No.
Um, if you can get someone who's in your office crying a lot and just is upset a lot of the time, you get them, if you have an EAP program, or you can
Right.
outsource some coaching or something. That's why we've developed this New Ways for Work program, method, is to help coach them to learn these skills so that the HR manager or their manager, supervisor, isn't constantly, feeling overwhelmed or just dreading seeing them. And that's one of the, by the way, one of the words we hear
Yeah.
the most is dread.
Dread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I dread this person because I am exhausted by the chaos. Those
Yeah.
three words we hear all the
Yeah.
time. So that's what we really try to do, is skill up the HR folks and any managers and supervisors to use simple skills. So one of them is connecting, and that's what you do with the calm before think. Setting limits is hugely important, and that's what I'm talking about with structure. And you have to set a lot of limits. Those are a gift for them,
Yeah.
because they don't set them themselves. They can't stop themselves because of this, amygdala that's so
Right.
powerful in the brain. And then, really learning to, when we communicate in writing with them, I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with all those emails. And you can always tell when you get when you get that zinger or that knot in your gut, and you go, you don't
Yep.
even want to open it or whatever. But then you look
Yep.
in there and you see those four things: blame, some kind of accusation, unmanaged emotions, threats,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
extreme behaviors, all of that. And so we've created a method of responding to them called BIF, brief, informative, friendly, and firm. And it's our top technique. Everybody loves BIF because it gives you structure in your writing back to them. Because honestly, I've seen organizations where one little email, 3 sentences, right? And it's sort of high conflict, or definitely high conflict. And the manager responds to it without BIF, and it causes about 12 hours of meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely time wasting
Yes.
meetings. It's
Yeah.
just insane when a BIF response would have handled it.
Right. I feel really validated right now because the last experience that I can think of where I had dealt with someone who kind of fits these characteristics, and actually in general, I always took this approach, which was really, now I understand the BIF method. And I feel very validated knowing that that is why it was so successful to send emails that were brief, informative, friendly, and firm,
Oh,
right?
look
Is
at
that
you. Yes.
say?
Yes, that's
I'm
it.
like, I love it. I think actually it's funny because now that I have a name for it, I know, I'll call it Biff from now on. But back in the day, I would just say, less is more.
Yep.
And it's just, it reminds me when you don't do that, when you send this long winded email explaining everything and you've wasted now 30 minutes of your time and you're going through everything. It's literally being like a hamster on a wheel and you just can't get off of it. And it's so chaotic because then they respond and it's all of these other things. And then you respond again. And it's just too much. But when you just follow the Biff method, it actually, in most cases really neutralizes the whatever it is that's causing that feeling and those emotions.
It really does. And it's, the brief part, like you said, is to help contain them. If you give a bunch of, here's what happens. Okay. So they get upset. They go to the keyboard. We got to vomit through the keyboard, right?
Keyboard warriors. Yeah.
But it's got to come out right now. This is it feels natural and necessary. When they get upset, they don't manage it like everyone else. So they go to the keyboard, the blame, the all or nothing, unmanaged emotions, the extreme behaviors come out through in that keyboard. Now, once they hit send, they feel better. Their anxiety comes down, right? Because they're trapped in right brain. That's where all the is, and they just put all that out through the keyboard. Now it's landed on your screen.
Now
and
we've
you
caught
look
the
at it. Exactly. And now this is what I see people doing. And I think HR folks are probably much more sophisticated than many others because you probably see this a lot more than others and develop these skills. But what I've seen many do is like lie awake in bed at night, perseverating over how to respond to one of these emails. And there's really no need to do that. So, because they're thinking, well, how do I respond to this accusation? How do I respond to this personal attack? Because HC high conflict stuff is personal. And they make personal attacks. So instead, what you have to remember is they've probably forgotten all of that after they hit send. Now, the issue there might be a nugget of an issue in there, but mostly not. Mostly they just need to, get all of that out of their right brain. So you have to avoid taking it personally, and you just don't. So, and that's why Biff really works is you keep it brief, because if you respond to every accusation in there and try to give advice or admonish them or anything, that's just going to get you more emails back. So just avoid all that. Totally. Keep it informative, stuck on, just stick to straight information. Don't defend yourself. And keep it friendly, just a friendly tone that just keeps the right brain happy. And then keep it firm, and firm gives it structure, right? That they are lacking. Now, one little bonus tip is part of the firm part or section is that you close it firmly and friendly with something like, well, have a great weekend, and that's it, right? But if you need a response back from them, end it with a question and at least two options, because this will force them to focus on a choice. Focusing on a choice means left brain problem solving activity. And the more time they spend in their left logic brain, the less time they're spending in the right reactive brain.
Interesting.
Right? And so they'll come back with Monday, if you say, okay, let me know if you'd like to meet on Monday or Tuesday, and they come back with Tuesday. And instead of getting a 42 paragraph email.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Actually, something that I think is probably worth mentioning too is that when we are dealing with potentially with people who, have these characteristics of being high conflict personalities, they also potentially tend to be the ones that pursue litigation because of this. If there's, and again, correct me if I'm wrong and if I'm totally speaking out of turn here, but I would imagine that, and I can think of my own personal experience with this, for those who really believe fully that they are in the right, that everything else, as someone is to blame for everything going wrong or not going their way, and then they're not happy or they're managed out or whatever, the end result is, that they often are the ones to pursue some sort of litigation against their employer. And there are circumstances, of course, where that is totally a worthwhile pursuit because maybe the employer did something wrong. But in a lot of cases, there's litigation that comes from employees who are just disgruntled, or in this case, potentially believe that they are fully in the right and that everybody else is wrong. And so using the BIF method can actually mitigate quite a bit of risk because, if you're keeping things professional and brief, you're not like unintentionally putting your foot in the mouth in something that actually would be part of discovery if there was a pursuance for some sort of lawsuit to come out of whatever it is. I mean, I've seen so many things, and it almost always goes nowhere, but and sometimes it goes somewhere, but in most cases it doesn't, and it's usually surrounding these individuals, unfortunately, who can be inconsolable with certain things. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree 100%. This is risk and cost mitigation. So if you go back to what I said about trust and safety, if you think about your own safety, when you're let's think about your greatest fear. So take a second, think about, okay, I'm afraid of heights, I'm afraid of spiders. For me, it's driving on icy roads, especially black ice, because I have zero control. It feels like I have zero, and I grew up in Nebraska and the roads were really icy sometimes and I hated it. So it sticks with me. When I'm in that fear mode, I want to get back to my regular safety default mode. So if that means I get behind the wheel of the car, or I can, better is even to get out of the car altogether so that I feel safe again. We all like to be in our default safe mode. So do these folks. Their fear that they don't even know about, they can't even name or identify or realize they have this, is something different. And it happens when things don't go well for them, or when their amygdala hears a tone of voice that it misidentifies as threatening, or sees body language or something like that. And so they are in that fear mode. And if you can be that person that uses BIF, that person that uses ear, that increases their safety, gets them back to, their default safe space. Now, if it's someone who kind of has these superior inferiority tendencies, the last thing you might feel like doing is saying, hey, I respect the work you do. Because it's the person that's saying, I need to be respected. I feel disrespected, and you say, I can respect the work. I really respect the work you do. That just calms their brain. That's an ear statement, right? So using these, I mean, it sounds so ridiculously simple.
Yeah.
It is ridiculously simple, except it's hard to do. It's hard to remember to do. You have to be disciplined, number one. And number two, you just have to remember and realize you're really helping them. What that will do, if they're feeling safe, they're going to feel less defensive. And you're right, they do like to litigate. They'd like to file complaints against licenses. They often go to law enforcement, to lawyers, to the courts, HR, anywhere they're seeking authority to agree with that they've been injured.
Yeah.
Right. So the more you use these tools, your risk goes down.
Right. Oh, that's so fascinating. Honestly, I feel like we could talk about this probably all day. I probably have a million more questions that I'm going to think about after we hang up today. But my final question for you is, what happens when someone is in a management role and has this high conflict personality? And let's say a listener is hearing this and is like, oh my gosh, that's my manager. How do they like manage up and use these skills and tools to deal with that? And two, I mean, how does that work? How does someone with this type of personality, which I'm sure that there are people with these, with high conflict personalities in all spectrums and all areas of business and potentially even government too. So how do we deal with and confront and manage up when our manager has a high conflict personality?
That is such a great question, because number one, like you said, they're kind of all over the place. And I like to say it is the most equal opportunity disorder or personality in the world, because, it's either, from a trauma background or role modeling that we had growing up, anything like that. So it can be from any, socioeconomic strata, from any cultural background. We've traveled all over the world, and the high conflict personality is the high conflict personality. So now, Um, Number two, the number one search term on our website, even when we were just in family law, right, was managing my narcissistic boss.
Yeah, see, there you go.
Mm-hmm. And it has been for 14 years, 14, 15
Wow.
years. So it is obviously a problem. And the background on why the boss might be in that role is because that fear type fears feeling inferior. And there's another fear type that fears feeling dominated. So, of course, they're going to be climbing the ladder. And that doesn't have
Oh
anything
my
to do with
gosh.
intelligence or skill. They've got those. And then you get this added, fear that's going to drive them to the top. They get
Wow.
in these roles, whether it's at work, whether it's at church, whether it's at a nonprofit, in government, wherever. I mean, that's where they go. So managing up is, it can be a really terrible situation. I've been in it myself, where I had the knot in my stomach, commuting to
Yeah.
work every day, did the happy dance when that boss resigned and moved on. But I didn't know these skills at the time. And we just use the same skills using ear with them, because they're going to respond as well. They're probably going to respond really well to respect. And you just keep things light and neutral. You ask them about, their weekend or something like that, and just make it about them. That's what really this has to be. The more you make it about them and the less about you, without sacrificing, right? It's just, they're just
Right.
little, I shouldn't say love bombs, but ear bombs you give them, and while keeping your own structure, keeping documentation of things, right?
Totally.
Which is a really good idea.
Yep.
Then you just spend that time connecting with that person instead of fighting against them. And here's probably, this just occurred to me. This is probably the best way to describe it, is you get this person on board with you against the problem, instead of having
Hmm.
them against you, you against them, right? So instead of
Yeah.
me against you, it's us against the problem. The problem meaning whatever the work project is, or and problem
Right.
sounds like a bad way to put it, but the
No, that's
whatever.
really interesting. That's so interesting. I mean, it's so funny because I've talked about on a couple episodes some experiences with bad leadership myself, which we all will always experience. If we haven't yet, or if you haven't yet, you will. And if you have already, you probably will again. And I've always, my friends and colleagues and I have always said, like, how do these people get in these roles? How do they become so successful? And when I say these people, I'm referring
Yeah.
to these leaders who potentially fit this characteristic, these four characteristics of having a high conflict personality. And I think of two leaders that I've had in my career that really, this just explains a lot of it. But we always talk about how did they get into these roles, and how did they become so, successful on paper, because they weren't successful in their roles, but they were successful in that they had climbed the ladders, the career ladders that they were, on, and their trajectory that they had. And this makes a lot of sense to me. This understanding the background behind not wanting to be dominated, not wanting to feel inferior or to be inferior. And I really like what you said about flipping the script and not making it about me versus you, but rather us versus the challenge or the opportunity or the problem. And actually, I'm sure a lot of people listening will think, well, what about me? Why aren't they focused on me? What about my development? I can vividly remember one of the poor leaders that I'd had, and I spent more time managing that leader than I did being managed or coached myself or probably doing anything else. And it has been fundamentally the most rewarding experience of my career, because it gave me a lot of tools to not only be able to, I don't want to say survive, but overcome that challenge, because it was challenging, but also to be able to see how you can manage. Because if you can manage up successfully and do all those things that you're sharing, Megan, then actually you'll have more growth from that than if this potentially high conflict personality is managing you in a way that you are probably not such an open recipient of. So I really like that.
Yeah, and you have to know yourself too. Are you a passive conflict avoider type person? Are you an aggressive person. I'm probably more of the aggressive where I'm.
Me too.
Thank you for. Oh yeah, man. My name is Megan,
I'm
and
not passive at all.
I'm, I'm going to, and it doesn't mean we're going to sock someone, punch them, but it's. I'm going to explain. I'm going to keep explaining or arguing or something, and instead you have to be. That's just going to escalate the conflict.
Right.
And if you're a passive person, if you this high conflict people will walk all over you, and it will embolden their aggression.
Yeah.
And so if you really want to have an assertive approach and just keep and assertive means using those tools we've talked about, and those really do, like you said, mitigate risk. They save you a lot of time. It's very, very fascinating if you just once you have an understanding of this high conflict area, and you get a handle on it, and remind yourself to use these skills. You might have to set something on your calendar every morning to remind yourself to get used to it, because there's the brain and emotions involved. It's a game changer, and I don't want to overstate it, but I've seen it really work, really help. And I think we have to recognize that, in our experience doing this work for 15 plus years with High Conflict Institute, and even 10, 15 years before that in other roles, we knew 15 years ago that high conflict personalities would be increasing in society, just based on the way things were going and what television teaches, and some parenting issues, trauma, all of that. And, here we are 15 years later, and that's what we do see. We see an increase in high conflict people, people with high conflict personalities, all across the world, in almost every industry. And particularly in the last 2 years, we've seen a huge influx, an increase of reports from our clients and potential customers, from all walks of life, particularly education, and a lot in the workplace, especially returning to work and in the physical office space and things. But a lot of us have anxiety throughout the shutdowns and the pandemic and things, but those with a high conflict personality, this is going to make it even more challenging. And so, HR needs to be skilled up with these tools, so you can really help in the best way, and use a lot of structure, but just open everything with ear, and then a little structure, ear and a little bad news, ear and a little whatever. Just start it with ear.
Start it with ear. I love that. Honestly, as predicted, I learned so much today, and I'm sure that I'll continue to learn from you as I follow you on your journey, and in the High Conflict Institute, and all the things that you do. And I don't know of a better place to stop and ask you to share where the audience can connect with you and learn more about this, because I'm sure there will be a ton of questions.
Well, we would love that. And I just love to talk to people, as you can tell. So it's highconflictinstitute.com. And, just go through our contact page, or my email is megan@highconflictinstitute.com. And I'm happy to talk anytime. And just a couple of books that your listeners might be interested in. One is Biff at Work. Bill Eddy and I just put that out last year. So
I love that.
Biff specifically for the workplace. And then the New Ways for Work method I talked about, you can find that on the website, and training for that kind of thing. So we have anything you want to see is on there.
Amazing.
And I forgot, we just launched this month the certification program, the High Conflict certification, so that if you want to be, have someone in your department that's skilled up as the high conflict certified person, that can handle that within your organization, then we just have that brand new.
I love that. I love that. Well, I will be sure, as always, to link everything in the show notes so that the listeners can easily just click and go and connect with you. And I'll definitely have to check out both of these books that you have. It sounds like there's still a lot more learning that we can all do. And actually, we know for sure that leadership and managing and HR takes a lot of work, and it's always changing. And the way that we skill up and the way that we respond to different personalities, whether they're high conflict or not, will always continue to evolve. And thankfully, there people like you and Eddie who are taking on the brunt of the work and creating the skills and the understanding and the certification processes for us.
All right. Well, I really appreciate it. And I just want to say I have mad respect for anybody that does this work. You guys do really good work and hard work. So we'll help where we can.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining the podcast family. And I will let you go. But thank you again. And we'll see you next week, everyone that's listening.